I went for a good 2.5 to 3 years probably, with just this sort of empty zombie feeling. On the outside, I kept up the facade. I mean, you're a pastor, for goodness sakes. But on the inside, I was an empty zombie for about 3 years. My name is Scott, and this is my story. I have been to clinical depression a couple times, brought on by a number of factors, but I think I would characterize most of it by saying, as a pastor who has a pretty unhealthy dose of people-pleasing and perfectionism, I am a good candidate to become a typical depressed pastor. There are a lot of them out there. I take on too much, which in Christian world looks like it appears to be, a godly thing, but it can actually be quite unhealthy. So for me in ministry, there were about 5 years of relational conflict that just never seemed to let up. I was working overtime to please everybody, 80 hours a week, not taking a day off, not taking all my vacation, not resting, always finding something to do, always taking the laptop home, and it just never stopped. There are other factors, of course, but ministry for me was the perfect storm. That clinical depression's where I got to twice. I was beyond exhausted. I didn't sleep well. Here's how I knew the first time that I was really depressed. We had this thing with my kids. At the time we had 2, now we have 3, but at the time we had this thing with our first 2 kids that we called giving Dad gas. And it was, Dad comes home, my wife Dagny would say, Daddy's home. I'd say, give me some gas, give me some gas. And they would run up and they'd give me a hug and they would fill my tank. That's what we talked about with giving gas. And I knew that I was depressed when a couple years into feeling like I was just walking around like this zombie, my 2 kids came up and giving me gas. I just remember feeling something is really wrong with me, because that doesn't even work. So the hardest part of all that, the hardest part of my struggle was allowing myself to sort of call it a valid struggle in the first place. That was one of the key pieces. Another part of it for me was learning to be really vigilant, almost militaristic, about keeping margin in my life for self-care, for Sabbath. There is tremendous power in sharing your burdens with one another. One of my favorite verses is Galatians 6:2, where it says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. So the law of Christ that Paul talks about there is love. His law is love. So when you are bearing one another's burdens, you're communicating that love of Christ to another person. And unless you share that with somebody, they can't bear that burden with you, which means not sharing is holding at bay the love of Christ that's available to you. So, the answer to having help and overcome the struggle is, in part, it's let someone else bear the burden with you. I'm now not ashamed to talk about having struggled with depression, even as a pastor. I used to hesitate to tell people because there were times where people would respond certain ways, oh, because you're a pastor. And I would fear that it would damage sort of their conception of me or this congregation. Now I don't really care what they think of me. I don't really care what they think of this congregation because I know that God does great work here. And I also don't care what people think of me because I know that sharing my personal brokenness will bring them face to face with those kinds of issues for themselves, and might be an entree into how God meets them in their brokenness. To tell the right story is to tell the story of the brokenness, not just that we once dealt with, but that we continue to deal with. And we don't do anybody any good when we talk as if I've brought myself out of that, or I don't struggle with that anymore. So I've been open about talking about depression as a real issue because honestly, many people struggle with it. I think to a greater degree than I do, but I just hope that it helps to tell the story of how God has worked in my life despite the struggle of being depressed, which has been going on for me for many years.